Good morning again, fellow flat-belly travelers and coffee chat friends out there in Electroland. Another little follow-up here on a discussion we had a few days ago at our coffee chat session here in Saskatoon. Once again, along the lines of improving the quality of our lives. How can we look at ourselves from a little bit of a different angle and maybe see something of ourselves in the discussion, which is so important, isn't it? One of our long-term members of the club here suggested this topic, and the topic was, when he sent it to me, it was activism in the process of ascension. I wasn't sure what that really meant, didn't have time to get back to him on it, so I just wrote up something that I felt was what I felt about it. The main topic, of course, was activism, and there was a comment made during the meeting that we spent a little bit maybe too much time on discussing what activism actually is, rather than getting to the point of what is our activism, or what are we active in. And we went around the room and got some input on what this is all about. And the gentleman who suggested the idea, it didn't really surprise me, because I kind of gotten to know him a little bit, and I realized that what he was talking about was something similar to what I was talking about, which is that, you know, we can talk about all kinds of stuff, but what are we actually doing about it, which is really important also, right? How are we implementing what we talk about in our lives? And the ascension aspect of it being, you know, how do we move ourselves forward? This is the idea of improving our quality of our lives. So this is kind of along the lines of what he had talked about. And there was a number of other things pointed out that were along the lines of very much, you know, what we're actually going to do. It wasn't necessarily at the beginning of the meeting, but there was one lady mentioned the idea of fluoride in the water, which I don't know much about it, honestly, but apparently that's something that people feel very strongly about. There were a few other points too made. I don't really remember if I'd written them down more, but maybe they'll come to me at some point. But I'll just relay some of the thoughts that I had, and maybe it'll twig something that you have, and you're welcome to chime in on the video log there as well. There's a comment section below it. I think you might have to sign into something, but you can make a comment anyways. But here's what it is anyways. The topic was activism in the process of ascension. Now, the idea of activism, I'll start out with that. It must be an important topic because we hear a lot about it, and many people consider themselves to be activists in some way or of some sort. I do have a confession to make, though, and this was a sentiment which was echoed by a few others there in our little round table at the beginning, which is that I don't really feel all that comfortable with the word activism, because, for the simple reason that it normally resolves around protest or disagreement of some sort of public policy. And when that was brought up, the guy who had suggested it said, yes, that's probably true, but the thing is, we usually hear about this through the media, the mainstream media especially, and whenever the word activism is used, it's usually to make it look like a bunch of hooligans carrying signs and throwing rocks and so on, and protesting this and that. And therefore that impression gets ingrained, and I'm also probably for certain, we're all subject to whatever comes our way and affected by it. So that's the baggage, I would say. So to me, this sort of protest anyways, or this sort of activism, this militancy, you might say, or disagreement of public policy, seems to almost empower the other side if there's two sides to an argument. For example, if there's an anti-war protest, if I'm an anti-war activist, I'm simply involving myself in another act of war. Because what I'm basically saying is you guys shouldn't be doing what you're doing. What you're doing is wrong. You should probably be doing things the way I see them. I would rather you be doing things the way I see them. So this is really another form of war, perhaps a little more peaceful, but still a kind of a war in a way. And there was a guy named George Carlin. Many of you remember him as a comedian. He was also very much of a, you might say, an activist in some ways for his political views. But he had a really interesting and sometimes harsh way of getting to a point through his humor. He once said that fighting for the cause of peace could be likened to screwing for the cause of virginity. So you see, you see how direct that was. That a little bit harsh, I understand, and I hope that doesn't offend anybody out there, but this was George Carlin's way, and it's just a quote that I quoted, an approximate quote, as I remember it. So it's for one thing to say that I'm uncomfortable with the word activism because of its usual connotation. It would be remiss for me to not suggest what I am more comfortable with. So I prefer the words, just simplify the word and say action or active, for the simple reason that they don't have as much baggage attached to them, from my impression. And I feel absolutely no need to be compliant to some sort of an ism. Because once you have an ism, then it seems like I would feel like I somehow belong to and must be compliant to that ism. You know, like Protestantism, Catholicism, or some sort of an ism, fundamental ism, feminism. Then I must be able to identify myself as such and so on. But if I'm just active, it doesn't have the sense that I'm belonging to some sort of an ism at that point. And therefore I feel more free, which is what I want in my quality of life. Now for a few words on the word ascension. The word ascension essentially starts out by saying it's an act of rising. If you look it up, it's an act of rising. And there once again is that word act. Right in the topic, activism, the process of ascension. Well, ascension is an act that we can involve ourselves in. And the importance of the word for us here at Coffee Chat, in this discussion, or as flat-belly fellow travelers, or what have you, is that we normally associate, just in a word picture at least anyways, but even realistically a lot of times, moving up or moving ahead as improvement. It's just the way we visualize things very often. I've met very few people in my life who consistently see the act of moving down as symbolical of improving, unless of course perhaps they were grave diggers or something like that, and then they were in the employ of digging holes, basements or something like that, so going down. But even that, they would have the sense that this is moving ahead in some way. It's improving the quality of their life some way, perhaps. So our actions then, in the process of moving us ahead, or ascending us in some way, with respect to our quality of life experience, is worth examining, wouldn't you say? So how to more effectively approach this in our lives is a really good place to start, I would say. Let's consider a couple of, fantasy people for a moment. And when I say fantasy people, from my perspective, as I repeat here over and over again sometimes, Coffee Chat and so on, is that when I'm talking, I'm really talking about myself. When somebody else is talking, they're really talking about themselves. No matter whether I'm saying you are doing this or they are doing this and so on. I'm really speaking for myself because that's the only point from which I can speak. But I'm just going to use this out in the general, just so we get the idea of considering scenarios, essentially. Consider somebody who wants more peace and tranquility in their life. Just consider that for a moment. Would they be best by going out and joining an activist group? Activists, by what my original connotation of joining a group to petition for a cause or to protest against some sort of legislation so that they can have others behave in a certain way so that their life can be more peaceful. Or would this individual be better off, at least first, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that former, but at least first, to examine how peaceful his or her own life actually is. Is he or she, once again I, perhaps, holding on to violent cultural traditions? Now this may sound a little bit harsh, but just be open-minded here. Violent cultural traditions such as male or female genital mutilation, or the tradition of poking holes in the ears of children for vanity purposes. Children in all three of these cases, or all of these cases, who are too young to make these decisions for themselves. That's kind of a question, really. Is she or he involved in child indoctrination in any form which the child is really not interested in at that point, such as teaching religion, enrollment in schools that the child seems to have no interest in, especially? How about teaching nationalism? Is he or she involved in imposing turmoil upon these children, which were imposed upon him or her, and in the meantime expecting a more peaceful life? In other words, continuing the same tradition and expecting different results. Surely we can see that there is no ascension or moving up towards true qualities of life if we continue along the same path in our own lives, with how we live our lives, while expressing outer violence. So it's a first look, isn't it? Consider another example of somebody who becomes aware of his or her actions with respect to his or her conscience. We talked about conscience the last time, remember? This individual begins to notice that his or her actions are out of alignment sometimes with his or her conscience, with what his or her conscience may be telling, may be saying. He or she notices that in order to bring actions into alignment with conscience is not necessarily easy. After all, he or she may have to let go of certain actions and adopt other ones, of course, to do with some of their so-called friends. There may be ridicule from those so-called friends for no longer showing up for drinks after work, as an example, because these drinks after work are recognized to may perhaps not be in alignment with what the conscience is saying. He or she may even find the greatest pressure in this change comes from family members who may at first express objection to what this individual wants to live as his or her truth in accordance and wanting to live in accordance with it. No matter what though, when he or she, this individual, I'm speaking it after all, recognize that actions must be in accordance with this voice of conscience, or else life is a lie. He or she will more clearly see that the inner truth must always be followed, or else there is never ascension in any meaningful way. Now, like this individual, we, all deep down inside, know that the conscience is always calling us towards a greater awareness of what we could call our higher self, or our deeper sense of self, or more truthful sense of self. So that, yes, while we do live on the superficiality, through the titles, through the names, through the, this moment I'm a father, this moment I'm a husband, or an engineer, or whatever, those superficialities, though we live through those and communicate through that superficiality, we come to clearly see that we're only acting through that. We, the real we, we've talked about this a lot before, the core we, what we really are. Meanwhile, while we're acting through that, our conscience, that deeper sense of ourselves, is always calling us in a never-ending call of ascend, ascend, ascend. This is the nature of nature itself, always wanting to grow. And ascend for us very often means this awareness of who we really are. This who we really are, if we look at it, are what creates us, and which creates our superficialities. We can always remember that it is us at the end of the day who decided to become the engineer, who decided to continue using certain labels and so on, and behave in certain ways in the community. This is our superficiality. So therefore we create it because we constantly agree to act through that. I would say then, in conclusion, may our actions create those circumstances, those superficialities, those results, which better serve us in our ascension and in our growth for ourselves and our brothers and sisters. This basically concludes what I had to say. And when I went through this, there was a couple of people who said, I don't really understand what you're saying. Are you for or against activism? Because that was the impression, perhaps, of what I was going to talk about, maybe. And my answer was, I'm not for or against it. This isn't the point of this. The point of it is for us to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, are our actions helping us to move forward in our quality of life? It's not really for me to say whether I'm for or against activism, if activism involves actions. Of course, we're all active in every moment. So if you want to look at that as a for, sure. But it comes down to what actions am I for or against? That's the only thing. It's not about being for or against the concept. It's which ones are most effective. And I hope that is helpful in maybe answering a little bit of the question. Thank you once again for listening. It's been a blast, and I'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye for now.